Hello, everyone, and welcome back once again to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, the show where we take you back to the good old days, just probably not exactly how you would expect from our title. I am Clayton Becker.
And I am Megan Cox.
And we've come to you today for the first time in 2026 after a real couple of weeks, huh, Megan?
Yeah. It's been a wild year.
Lemon, it's Wednesday.
Yes.
Literally. What are we going to talk about, Megan? Coming back after 2 weeks of the new year.
Yeah, right. I thought I'd ease us back in after a deserved break with a show titled Reject Random State Violence and Embrace Accountability.
Okay, all right. I think we may have had something around embrace accountability before, but it seems like we still need it, right?
We definitely have. Yeah. This is going to be a very specific type of accountability, and it is specifically for armed agents of the state or agents of the state in general.
Understood. Yeah, I mean, we had this whole plan. Megan and I were like, we've got like 3 or 4 different episodes we're excited to talk about. But then the first 2 weeks of this year were just such a shit show. So yeah, we're rejecting random state violence, embracing accountability.
And we do keep saying that this isn't a news podcast, and then we keep feeling compelled to respond to the news. And
the news is quite compelling these days, is it not? Yes.
Yes, indeed.
In the interest of responding to some of the news, what specifically are we talking about here, Megan?
So, we have previously discussed the shortcomings of U.S.'s immigration and customs enforcement, and I think that we should offer a follow-up given the recent killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis. As we speak, we're continuing to learn of other non-fatal shootings by ICE across the country, as well as other tactics and enforcement techniques of questionable legality.
Questionable, yeah.
It's the most generous interpretation I can give it.
Most generous way we could describe it possible. Yes.
Yeah. So I think we should talk about it. I think we should talk about what kind of violence is happening here and why it is, in what way it is diverging from the norm of accountability for state agents who are engaging in these behaviors, and why I think we need to bring that accountability back into the equation.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Seems like a reasonable plan of an episode here. Where exactly are we starting then? Are we starting with what ICE is doing? Are we starting with what the norms are? Where take us on a journey.
I will take you on a journey. Where I would like to start is by thinking a little bit about what the purpose of this behavior is. Because for months now, what we've been seeing is unusually aggressive immigration enforcement, where you see a deliberately planned surge of immigration enforcement officers coming into particular communities, be that LA, Portland, Chicago, now Minneapolis. You see that surge of enforcement seem to be deliberate and calculated to provoke some sort of feeling, some sort of sentiment amongst people in that community, be that positive or negative. There are immigration enforcement officers in each of these communities already, and you are seeing their numbers artificially inflated by people outside of their communities, which is how you get in a situation where agents have to be put up in hotels, and hotels may or may not want to do that, and people may or may not be protesting at the hotels. They're coming from outside of these communities into these communities. And so that is the level of deliberateness with which this is happening at the highest levels of government. So I want to start us there and say this, whatever we're seeing, it's intentional.
Yeah, I think that's, there's nothing inevitable about what's going on, right? There are always and have always been like immigration enforcement operations. We can talk about the degree to which we agree that those operations should have happened in the first place.
In fact have.
Yeah, right. We have a whole episode on it, right? Not to rehash that episode too much, but like a crucial thing to understand here is that nearly all immigration violations are civil violations. They're civil in nature. Being undocumented in the United States is not in and of itself a criminal violation. Crossing the border illegally is a misdemeanor the first time that you do it, and then it's like I believe a low grade felony if you do it after having been deported, right? But none of these violations are like categorized in any way as like violent crimes or having like aggravating circumstances or anything of the sort, right? And so looking at the very deliberate aggressive tactics that Trump's ICE department has been doing, it's very deliberately an outsized reaction. There's nothing about
disproportionate.
Yes, there's nothing about the nature of the violations in question here, no matter what violation it is, like as a purely immigration related matter, that justifies this kind of activity and treatment. None whatsoever. And so I think it's important to start there as well.
So something I want you, Clayton, and anybody who's listening to this episode to keep that concept of proportionality and disproportionality in the back of your mind, because we're going to come back to it and it's very important. I obviously am not inside the mind of Secretary Noem, President Trump, any sort of decision maker in this White House. I don't know what's in their hearts or whatever. So this is naturally going to be somewhat speculative, but the manner in which the administration is handling communication around these activities as well makes the aggression appear very intentional. This aggression also has a cost, and it is turning off people who would like to see immigration laws enforced, just not through the tactics that are being employed here. You have a legion of normies in the middle who think that you should come to this country the right way, but also don't want to see toddlers being tear gassed in their parents' cars, which is a thing that happened, I think, in Minneapolis, possibly today or yesterday. So
for those who aren't aware of this particular episode, it's a family was driving home from a son's basketball game. They were not participating in the protest. They inadvertently found themselves in the middle of one of these like operations and protests and what have you. And ICE agents launched tear gas into their vehicle. The infant child of the family needed to be hospitalized as a result. So that's
because you shouldn't tear gas an infant; their lungs can't take it.
Well, yeah, I mean, realistically, you probably shouldn't.
Lungs.
Yeah, you shouldn't be tear gassing anyone, but you especially shouldn't be tear gassing.
Especially shouldn't be tear gassing an infant.
Yeah, so that's the episode we're talking about here specifically.
Yeah, just thank you for that. Thank you for that background and giving folks the context on that. That is the sort of thing that will turn off a quote unquote middle of the road type of person. So why are we doing this? I think there are two reasons. I think there are two audiences for this behavior. The first are the people who agree with them and who are loving this. They are eating this up. These are the folks that feel as though they are being jumped over by quote unquote illegals or just immigrants in general for things that they feel entitled to. They're the people who retweet and repost those, deport 100 million people memes, which by the way, that then includes natural born citizens if you're deporting 100 million people out of this country. So those folks love this. They are the audience for those posts from the different departments in the government that appear to be at the very least fascism adjacent.
Yeah, this is like the diehard MAGA fans, right? Like the people who like look at the ASMR deportation videos and then say, "This is what I voted for." Right?
I want more of this content, please.
The people
absolutely.
for whom there is not a deep enough circle of hell, quite frankly.
Yeah. I doubt these people are listening to this podcast unless we trick them with our tongue-in-cheek title, which was kind of part of the point. But I do think that those folks are seeing this and are reveling in it. And part of this behavior is to keep that base revved up and excited and happy about what's going on. Now, the second audience are the people like you and me, who are horrified, who don't agree, who could either be subject to immigration enforcement or who would otherwise be inclined to protest it. For those protesters, DHS is effectively saying, you're making me do this. Why are you making me hit you? We are going to continue this behavior and we are going to scare you back inside.
I would argue that the second audience is potentially the more intended audience, frankly. They can rely on like the right-wing media ecosystem to push out what they're doing regardless, right? And then I would argue also that there's perhaps you mentioned it in passing there, but like a third maybe discrete audience of, as you said, people who might be subject to deportation operations, who they're trying to get to leave the country on their own, right? Who they're trying to scare into leaving. And I think that might be like, I don't know if you have seen these advertisements, Megan, but there's like ads that the Department of Homeland Security runs with Kristi Noem basically saying like, it's like an image of an airport and like a military plane on a runway. And she's like, if you're an illegal immigrant, this runway is your future. And then she goes along to be like, if you leave voluntarily, you could have a chance to come to the United States the right way. But if you don't, you will be found and you will be deported. Like, these are ads that just sometimes show up on like YouTube, I think, probably because of the research I end up doing for this show on occasion.
We have truly fucked up our algorithms.
We really have. But I think that audience also matters here, and they're trying to scare people into leaving.
I'm sure that's probably the case. I think it's very much both those who are allies and those who have the option of leaving, because there are also a lot of people who are, the children of natural born citizens who may not have citizenship in the same way that you think in their parents' home countries. So some people are just kind of stuck.
Some people are indeed kind of stuck.
And so it's a very complicated thing.
And ICE has made it pretty clear that they're just targeting people who aren't white, and then figuring out later whether or not they have a right to be in the United States, which is how you see several hundred American citizens getting detained by ICE over the last year.
Mm-hmm. There are going to be a number of times at which I am at a loss for words in this episode, I think, which is hysterical given that I wrote the script. But anyway, we're going to try our best to avoid that. But I mean, really, we're debating who the intended audience is and what their purpose is. Does the purpose really matter? No. The effect is what matters. Mm-hmm. And the effect of random state violence, which is what this is, if people driving through a enforcement operation accidentally are subject to state violence, then you could do that yourself and also be subject to state violence. The effect of random state violence is to quell dissent. It's to stop people from coming out into the street and protesting, stopping people from behaving in solidarity, providing services to those who are actually targets of this behavior. If any, I'm gonna back up really quick just to say how this works. By removing our ability to calculate the risk involved in protesting. If any act of dissent can be met with violence up to and including permanent maiming and death, even if the person dissenting isn't violating the law and isn't themselves being violent, people will decide it's too dangerous because they can't figure out when it will be safe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you may have seen the Department of Homeland Security telling people not to bring their children to protests. Have you seen this?
Mm-hmm.
So let's just for a second unpack that. The act of attending a protest is now an act of consent to state violence against you, apparently. It used to be that you could decide if you were going to behave in such a way at a protest that you would possibly be a subject of state violence. If you just go and march and film and shout, but don't damage property and don't engage in violent acts, you'll be left alone because the state is not justified in using violence against you. That's apparently not the case anymore, is what the Department of Homeland Security is telling people.
Yeah, ICE has decided basically that any expression of dissent is an expression of what Kristi Noem called, when she described Renee Nicole Good after her agents shot her, was as a domestic terrorist. Anyone who expresses dissent is now a dissident, right? Is now someone who can be subject to state violence. And I think it's not even just people who are actively protesting, right? It's people who find themselves near a protest. And then it's also people who just happen to look the wrong way, right? Like, I have a cousin who lives in Minneapolis, and have friends who live there as well. And I think it's important to describe to people sort of exactly what ICE is actually doing there. Like, what ICE is doing in Minneapolis, by and large, there are obviously various things that they're doing, but the primary thing that they're doing is rolling around in these convoys of like 10 to 20 people, looking for non-white folks who are alone, and literally just rolling up, all 20 of them, jumping out of their vehicles and snatching the person off of the street. It all happens in like a minute and a half. And unless you are able to like get that person's name, like unless there are people following the convoy, like that person is just gone. You don't know where they're being taken. You don't know what's happened to them afterwards, right? If they're a citizen, they're ostensibly let go, although ICE has deported citizens in the past, mistakenly, right? Or deported people who have some sort of protected status or permanent residency here because they've made a mistake. They've lost people in their facilities, right? But this is why people are following ICE agents, right? That's the reason that they're doing it. It's because ICE agents are rolling around in convoys in these like big Chevy Suburbans or Cadillac Escalades. They're jumping out of their vehicles, and they're literally like, it's indistinguishable from kidnapping. Like, except that there are a lot more people than there would be in a typical kidnapping, right? And
yeah. Usually you're not rolling 20 deep for something like that. Yeah.
That's why people are following ICE agents around. You might be asking yourself, like, if you've seen some of these encounters on the news, like, how is it that this is happening so regularly? How do they know where the ICE agents are? Why are they always following the ICE agents around? That's why they are following the ICE agents around, because it is like indiscriminate violence against people who are just on the street, minding their business, who they don't usually have warrants for. Like, it is, as the title of the episode suggests, actually random state violence. And so people who are like a dedicated network of observers following ICE agents around to ensure that they cannot just snatch random people off the street and disappear them. That's what's happening here. That is why these encounters are so frequent and so common.
I have so many thoughts, and not all of them do I want to voice into a microphone about that. But that element of randomness means that the only way to protect a community from that sort of behavior is to be with the officers rather than with people who might be subject to that behavior or to that violence. You really, if what you want to do is even just get a name or hold some sort of accountability for, like, oh, okay, so Joe Smith was just picked up off the street. We're going to need to figure out where Joe Smith is. Can Joe Smith shout his wife's phone number to me, and I can call her and tell her what happened so she can start trying to find him? That sort of thing. That's the process that's happening here. It's not just about stopping ICE from quote unquote doing their job. It is about stopping people from disappearing into the maw of the system.
Yes, precisely. That's what is happening here.
And we also act as if there is no harm in somebody being picked up and then let go later. Depending on how long it takes you to prove your citizenship, which most of us don't have to do, quite frankly, then it takes that amount of time. It takes that amount of missed work, family problems or struggles that might result from, like, do you have childcare? Is CPS being notified when when a single mother is picked up that somebody needs to be watching her kids? Are her kids taken away from her because she is no longer there? There's a lot to this. And so the effects of just picking up random people off the street are significant. And I just can't say this enough. When Kristi Noem says that all of the enforcement action is targeted, that does not appear to be in congruence with the facts on the ground.
Yeah, I think an important thing to understand here is that you should literally not believe anything that comes out of DHS, the Trump administration. They have a proven track record of lying out of their asses at this point. Like, every single thing they tell you, you should treat with skepticism. You should not believe it until it is confirmed by other sources. Like, you simply should not believe them. They have made it very clear that they are willing to lie to the American public's faces, like blatant lies. Not like, I'm going to use some weasel words here. I'm going to technically tell the truth, but in a way that makes it seem like I'm saying something that I'm not intending to say. It's none of that. They are willing to blatantly lie to people's faces. And then on top of that, I think it's also worth noting that one of the costs to ICE's indiscriminate violence and indiscriminate taking of people off the street and not tolerating like legally protected dissent, right? Like free speech, people filming them, is the actual like physical health consequences of all of this. I don't remember if this was in Minneapolis in particular, but there was an episode where a like teenager, I think an employee of the Target, was filming ICE agents as they went into the Target. The ICE agents decided that they had had enough of this. They tackled him to the ground, threw him in their vans, and then dropped him off after having roughed him up, basically, in a Walmart parking lot a few blocks away. He wasn't charged. They didn't take his name. No one has accused him of doing anything wrong, right? And there are like very real physical consequences for him. There is a protester who was recently hit with a less lethal munition, who has been blinded in one eye. And then obviously we saw the thing that like kicked off all of this news cycle, shooting Renee Nicole Good because she was trying to escape when the ICE agents were trying to force her out of her vehicle, right? Like, it's not just that like, oh, well, they've, done something and then they drop them off later and there's like consequences to their life logistically. There are like actual physical consequences to life and health that are the consequence of this random state violence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, like, the unpredictability of the violence and the fact that the violence can come to you in your home as well. There's another instance in which a residential neighborhood was tear gassed. Tear gas is used to get people to leave a place. You can't be doing that in a residential area. Anyway, where are people supposed to go? The unpredictable violence is only part of the story. The other thing that is massively problematic about all of this is the obvious lack of accountability, as well as we saw spin out of how the officer involved in Renee Good's killing has been treated and has behaved since that incident.
That is the total and utter impunity with which they're acting.
Yeah, it's blows my mind, and this is one of those situations where me having a little bit more information makes me even more poleaxed by the entire situation. So this episode started off in my Twitter drafts, and that was because I wanted to outline for people how far what we've seen from ICE has diverged from a normal law enforcement procedure after what is usually termed an officer-involved shooting. Reminder for folks that I used to make law enforcement policy. My credentials are my 4 years as policy manager for the Oregon State Police. Obviously, the Oregon State Police don't endorse this. I don't work there anymore, blah, 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 whatever. But let me tell you what's normal so you can see how this ain't it. When there is an officer-involved shooting, here is what happens. Immediately, if the officer needs medical care, they are assessed and given that care. There is some debate about the officer involved here needing medical care. I'm not going to touch that. But if the officer needs medical care...
They're lying out of their asses. The thing that they like the
injury they're claiming is impossible.
Yes, what they are describing is not possible. Describing him as having internal bleeding in the torso describes things that simply could not have happened, even if he were hit by the car going at that speed. Like,
I mean, my operating theory here is not unlike how an NHL team will say that somebody has a, quote, lower body injury and give as little information as possible. Internal bleeding could be you have an ulcer because you're all stressed out because you killed somebody. But, not to make light of this, but it's...
The medical professionals I have spoken to in my life about this say that a medical professional would not describe any of the possible things that he had as internal bleeding in the torso. It could be that lay people are describing an ulcer or a bruise as being internal bleeding, right? But you would not describe that either of those things.
A medical professional would not call it that.
The medical professionals in my life who I have spoken to have said that no practicing medical professional would call any of the possible things internal bleeding in the torso.
And we are assessing this on the basis of the speed of the car and the weight of the car and how far the car traveled. That's why we're saying, okay.
Even if he were hit by the vehicle, which the video seems to make it clear that he was not in fact hit. Anyway, let's move on. So, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So first thing. All right. Here's what happens. First thing, if somebody needs medical attention, that happens. Next, the officer's firearm is confiscated. It is evidence. So if it is a shooting, and I am talking generally about OIS's shootings, the officer's firearm is confiscated as evidence. In some cases, the officer's clothing is also confiscated, and the officer is given a change of clothes. The officer is placed on paid administrative leave. Why is this leave paid? This tends to be a problem for some folks. So let's talk about it. Why is this leave paid? Because until an investigation is conducted, we don't know if the officer involved was engaged in wrongdoing or not. And whether that level of wrongdoing, if it exists, would lead to a decrease in pay as opposed to other forms of discipline. In most departments, the leave changes to unpaid leave if or when the officer is indicted for a crime.
I think it's important to also highlight to people that this is the process, even when it is like obvious to everyone involved that the officer acted correctly, that like someone was actively shooting at them and they returned fire.
Yep.
This still happens, right?
Yes.
This isn't just what happens when the circumstances look bad for the officer or when there's murky circumstances. This happens even when it is like abundantly clear that the officer acted correctly.
Yes, and legally you do it the same way every time because then there's no indication before the investigation happens that the investigation is being prejudged in any way. Marion County, Oregon, where I worked, had a policy that every OIS, I think, every OIS that resulted in a homicide went to grand jury, which we're going to talk about in a second. But that level of we do it the same way every time, that is how you ensure that the situations are being treated equally. That's how you ensure this accountability, which is what we're building towards here. So the officer is paid on paid administrative leave. They are sent home. They are sent home with a buddy officer. That buddy officer is a friend of theirs whose job it is to keep the officer calm and off their phone and available for investigators to speak with. This person is not the same as a union representative or an attorney, though the officer may have those people involved as well, depending on their whole situation, whether or not they're in a union, whether or not they're retaining counsel, etc. Meanwhile, the investigation has already started. 2 investigations are going to happen. They're usually going to happen sequentially rather than simultaneously. The criminal investigation happens first. This is because weedsy detail. Police officers, like all of us, have a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. So they can't be compelled to answer questions to someone who could then use it against them in a court of law. However, you can be compelled to answer in an employment context. So in an employment investigation, afterwards, the officer can be compelled to answer a question, and that may be the reason that they wind up fired, but they can't be compelled to answer that question in the criminal context. You don't want the compelled responses to sneak into the criminal investigation, and so that's why it happens in that order. Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. All right. So some jurisdictions, like Marion County, like I was saying, have a policy of taking every officer involved shooting to a grand jury. That grand jury then decides if the conduct warrants a criminal trial. The officer may or may not be investigated by their own department. Usually that depends on the size of the department and whether there can be sufficient separation between the investigator and the investigated. If you can't create that separation, another department may be the ones who investigate. Once the criminal investigation is completed, then you have a workplace investigation. Even if the shooting wasn't criminal, the officer may still have violated department policies, and this investigation assesses that. Maybe your department has a policy against shooting into a moving vehicle for many good reasons.
Most
that is a
departments
policy.
have this policy, by the way.
In many departments, yes. Nobody runs out into the street and shoots after a moving car anymore. That shit's only in the movies. Anyway, that's the process. And so any questions before we move on with what is a normal process?
Well, so I think I broadly understand what the normal process looks like, but I think perhaps one should ask at this juncture, to the best of the public's knowledge here, has any of this happened with this particular incident in Minneapolis?
Not to my knowledge. And, honestly, it would be pretty normal of a department to say, this is awful. We're investigating, obviously, there's a lot we need to figure out. We're very concerned about blah, 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 whatever, but we're investigating. The officer's been placed on leave pending a full criminal investigation. Just say a normal fucking thing. Not the woman was a terrorist and she got what she deserved.
Yeah, see, this is how you know that they don't actually think that she was a domestic terrorist, though, because in every public appearance afterwards, they've described it as, oh, well, this terrible tragedy that should never have happened. If they actually believed that she was a domestic terrorist, they wouldn't be describing it as a tragedy. Like, if you actually believed that this woman were some sort of domestic terrorist, you would not be describing her murder as a tragedy. You simply wouldn't. You would not be describing it as a tragedy. And that's how you know that they fucked up in the initial public reactions, but because the administration is constitutionally incapable of recognizing wrongdoing, they are simply not doing any of the things that you would normally do in this situation.
I mean, the idea that, and I've seen this reported, I'm not 100% sure it's accurate, so I don't want to hang too much on it, but that the officer was moved out of state, outside the reach of the criminal justice system of Minnesota, is an interesting fact, if true.
Well, there's also the element of that the officer who did the shooting, whose name I cannot remember, and honestly
not saying it intentionally.
Doesn't deserve to have his name remembered, right?
Yes.
The fact that he left the scene after the shooting, even that is completely outside of protocol for any law enforcement agency. If you leave that scene, you are actively altering an active crime scene by leaving. That's also not something that is done, right? You are supposed to remain there for the officer in charge of a federal investigation, right? You are supposed to
come and find, yes, you need to be in contact with the investigators. Yes, exactly. Also, not for nothing, after hearing for so long the idea, well, you should comply. Why didn't you comply? Participate in the investigation. The truth will out. An unwillingness to do that same thing is awfully hard to swallow, I think, for a number of people. And
then, of course, the fact that the federal government has basically tried at all avenues to stop Minnesota from investigating this themselves, right?
Yes.
The FBI taking over the investigation immediately. None of this is normal, is basically what we're trying to say.
No,
right?
No, it's not. Honestly, the way, if I were trying to design a process, which we will talk about more in the back half, but if you were trying to design a process that looked fair and looked impartial and looked reasonable, the FBI should not be investigating. There are many departments in Minnesota that are perfectly capable of investigating this crime because it is, at the end of the day, just a homicide. It's really that simple. The only thing that complicates this is specifically what they're investigating, whether or not this homicide was justified. Now, there are many different types of quote unquote justification for homicide. Self-defense is probably the most common. This is a type of self-defense, basically. Was the act of violence, and we're talking about shooting, so shooting, was the shooting justified? How do we know if state violence is justified? The Supreme Court has helpfully given us some really good tests to figure this out. The Supreme Court has told us to use the Graham factors from a case called Graham v. Connor. The Graham factors, I would like you to know, are posted on the wall in all the classrooms of the Oregon Public Safety Academy, and recruits get quizzed on them constantly. Like they're in line for lunch getting asked about the Graham factors. These factors are judged by a reasonable officer's perspective in the place of the officer who used the force. So something like, was she turning her car tires away? If the officer can't see because they can't see through the hood of a car, that's not a fact that is going to matter for that officer's judgment at the time. But the factors are severity of the underlying offense. So obstruction of administrative proceedings, blocking traffic versus something like murder. The immediate threat. Does the subject of the violence pose an immediate threat to the officer? Are they actively resisting or fleeing? Hold that thought. And then contextual factors. Things like saying, I'm not mad at you. So now let's talk about that fleeing part. For more detail, look at Tennessee versus Garner, which tells us that fleeing alone is not enough and is dependent once again on the underlying offense. Obstruction of administrative proceedings versus murder. It shouldn't surprise us that these are the factors, I don't think. They are what we feel instinctively is outrageous in the death of Renee Good. What was her underlying offense? Did she present an immediate threat, and was she actively resisting? Her underlying offense does not seem to justify her death. I think we're going to be arguing about the immediacy of the threat and whether or not she was resisting. But it just doesn't seem that this was justified within our own sense of what is right and wrong, in addition to the legal sense.
You know, the most insane defense I have seen of this is that the ICE agent could not have reasonably moved out of the way, despite the fact that he did.
Falls under contextual factors as well as immediacy of the threat.
Yeah, so despite... Let me back up. So despite the fact that, like, the video clearly shows that he had moved out of the way by the time that he fired the shots, the defense that I've seen is that he could not have moved out of the way because the ground was too slippery to do so safely. Because there was snow. Because it's January.
Stand your
in
ground
Minnesota.
because it's slippery.
Yeah. This is the most outrageous, like, thing I've seen someone say. That, like, because, you know, you bring up as a contextual factor, one thing you could do in this scenario is take a step slightly to the right? Instead of shooting someone 3 times. That's a sort of reasonable thing you could have done. The most insane thing I have seen someone say is that, well, the officer couldn't have done that because it was too slippery. Because the ground was slippery. Because there was ice.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that up. It's like how much of grasping at straws people are doing here to try to justify this event.
Yeah. You know, this has come up before, that if the standard is that a random member of the public has to behave perfectly and an officer can be Paul Blart, we are going to have a really hard time kind of maintaining the balance between public safety and the people who are meant to be kept safe.
It is insane to expect that your, like, average random civilian on the street does not panic or, like, acts perfectly while trained law enforcement officers are like allowed to completely shit the bed in every way possible, right? Like,
Yeah.
we talked about
We've
this in the
flipped the burden from where it needs to be.
we talked about this in the last episode that we did on ICE, right? But like you said, and I remember this quote, I think because it was a good quote, is that like such a big part of training a new officer is training them to put their ego in a box for 12 hours a day or whatever, right? It is very obvious that ICE agents are not being trained in any sense of the word to put their ego in a box, right? They are acting with total impunity, as though people have to obey their commands without question, exactly the way that they envision them in their brain, without a moment's hesitation or any sort of dissent as to whether or not the orders that they are being given are lawful in the first place. Because something we haven't even mentioned, right, 40 minutes into the episode here, basically, is that ICE does not have any real legal authority over American citizens, right? They just don't. They're not a normal law enforcement agency in that way. There are certain degrees to where, like, as we're talking about with like the interference with administrative procedure or whatever, right? All that kind of stuff. American citizens, to the best of my knowledge at least, Megan, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this. This is just something I've heard through the grapevine. Are not like required to identify themselves as American citizens by providing documents if ICE agents ask them to. ICE agents are not allowed to detain you on the basis of you not identifying yourself as a citizen through documentation or by giving your name so that they can show up at your house later and accost you for some trumped up charge, right? No pun intended. But like, that's sort of what we're talking about here, right? Is that ICE agents are acting with total impunity as though they have like an absolute right to be obeyed, despite the fact that they absolutely do not. And the fact of the matter here is that this is very obviously not something that is only pertinent to the new, like, terrible recruits that they're getting. I don't know, Megan, if you saw this piece in Slate earlier this week about how ICE has absolutely no idea who they're hiring. But
I didn't read the whole piece, but I saw an interview with its author, and it's wild.
It's wild, bonkers, right? Go and read this piece in Slate. If you search up like Slate, ICE has no idea who they're hiring. Like you will find it, right? But the person involved, again, whose name we're not going to say, in the shooting of Renee Nicole Good, was reportedly a 10-year veteran of the agency, served in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Or at least one of the two. Like, one of those guys who you would very much expect to not, like, engage in this kind of behavior, right? Like who you would expect to maybe be a little bit more capable of putting their ego in a box because they've been through ostensibly
doing it for a while,
the kind of law enforcement training you are supposed to get. And so I think that it really speaks to the importance of the accountability piece here. Like, it really speaks to the importance of the impunity with which these people are acting, that they just know that they can get away with whatever, because Donald Trump's administration, Kristi Noem, all of them are not going to lift a finger to actually hold them accountable, and instead are going to move heaven and earth to ensure that they do not have to face any sort of accountability.
Yep, absolutely. It's very important that they do face accountability. So after the break, we are going to talk about what accountability is, why it's important, and how we need to bring it back in the system. Welcome back, everyone. When we left you, we were discussing all of the many ways in which our current process of non-accountability really is
like anti-accountability, quite frankly.
Anti-accountability is harming our ability to participate in democracy, society, why it's bad. But in this next half, we're going to talk about what accountability can look like, why it's important, and how we bring it back.
Yeah, there's an immediacy that is like really felt that I can't quite put into words here. But I think there's not much hope that there will be accountability before the midterms, right? At the very, very, very earliest. So a lot of what we're going to talk about here is sort of what we think needs to happen, like, long term, when someone who is interested in accountability is in the White House, is in office, right? when Democrats have the ability to actually create some accountability mechanisms, as it were.
Yeah, I've always had a little bit of skepticism of Juan Lin's and his argument that prime minister systems or parliamentary systems are better than presidential systems. But this is one of those times where I really wish a vote of no confidence was possible to clear out the executive branch.
Yeah,
we could use one of those right now. But we have what we have. First though, I want to talk about just the idea of accountability, which I think is going to get to your kind of nebulous sense of immediacy that we need something to fix this. You remember a few minutes ago when I outlined what a normal OAS process looks like?
I do recall.
What do you think about that? Do you think that that's a process that gives people confidence that state violence, when it does happen, is justified?
I mean, no, not really. Like, it's clearly better than not doing anything at all.
Mm-hmm.
But it does seem to me, and I'm sure to a large number of people in the public, and probably certainly large proportion of our audience, that these procedures just do not work very well. Right?
Okay.
Like, I don't really like my sense of accountability here, and I'll like abstract away from maybe the sort of specific pieces of procedure for a moment, is something that helps it be so that these kinds of things don't happen in the first place, right? That like, it's not sufficient that there is like an investigation when an officer shoots someone in a way that is unjustified. It's that the accountability procedures need to be such that an officer would not like think of doing such in the first place, right? That they would the incentive structure would be there, that like an officer would just know that if they engage in like bad behavior, they would be held accountable, and as a result, they would do it less often.
Oh, for sure. And I do want to suggest to you that is an incentive structure that exists within. When this is actually happening, that incentive structure is created by this process. I would pick a little bit at the idea that this is not sufficient. I don't know that I disagree with that. I do think that this is necessary, if not sufficient, for accountability. It is the first step or the bottom rung of accountability, is to have a process like this by which these incidents are adjudicated. We need to be every time evaluating what the standard is for law enforcement shooting and whether or not an individual shooting was justified within the law, and if it wasn't, assign a penalty to it.
Yeah, I think that I'd agree that this is like a necessary condition, perhaps not a sufficient one. One of the things that I think, and this is like maybe not like a what most people sort of think when they're thinking about this, but like I am like deeply annoyed by the fact that when a police officer does engage in malfeasance and there is like a criminal penalty, it is the city which has to like foot the financial bill, like the civil penalty. I really don't love that. Mm-hmm. I like, I'm sure there are like possible reasons why this isn't done. Mm-hmm. Like, I haven't really looked into it all that carefully, but like when people say to me like the police pension fund should have to pay like officer involved shooting costs, like that sounds really attractive to me. Mm-hmm. Like, y'all are the ones engaging in the bad behavior. It shouldn't fall to taxpayers to like cover the financial costs of the settlement.
Well, I mean, first of all, the police pension fund is taxpayer dollars that have passed through to the pension fund. But, that's not your point. I would suggest something like, so when I was a practicing attorney, I had to pay into the professional liability fund. That is absolutely something that could exist in a law enforcement context. Realistically, what's going to happen is it's going to be the same thing as taking it out of the pension fund. Your salary is going to include paying into the PLF. And then if there is a settlement, then the PLF pays the settlement. I'm fine with that. That's a great policy idea. Totally cool. I also know some people who work in law enforcement who have started taking out personal liability insurance. And I don't think that's a bad idea. If I worked in law enforcement, I would probably do that. Because, how much can it cost versus if you need it, you really need it. But I would also kind of take us to a place here where why is having a process that adjudicates behavior and then punishes it if it's wrong or outside of the norms or laws as, we codify our norms, why is that important? And we talked in the front half of the episode about how predictable patterns of behavior are important for people so that we can make decisions. So when violence becomes random, we have no way to predict anymore. Humans are evolved to see patterns, and one of the things that pattern recognition allows us to do is identify how somebody's going to behave in certain circumstances. Usually these are just norms and there's no real punishment, but in a situation like this where the violator has power over us and the thing they've done is break the law, that needs to be remedied in a way that then restores all of our belief in the pattern that we previously had recognized. And so this sort of public demonstration of the recognition that someone's behavior was not within the norms, was not okay, is not supported, is not tolerated, that's really, really important for all of us as we go forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think a piece of this that I sort of keep coming back to is it also matters for us to be able to structure our own behavior, right? We understand, at least implicitly, that if we engage in rule breaking, law breaking behavior, that there is a potential for us to be held accountable, that there's a potential for us to be treated badly, even if we recognize at the same time that simply violating the law does not justify inhumane treatment at the hands of law enforcement. There's at least the recognition that you don't want to put yourself in a bad situation, right? And that's sort of a part of the incentive structure that we talked about. But when violence is entirely random and there is functionally nothing you can do to insulate yourself from potential violence at the hands of the state, then it just becomes you can't live your regular everyday life, right? You can't go and drive your children home from a basketball game for fear that you may encounter ICE agents who may claim that you are blocking the road, because again, they have this just entirely culture of impunity that has taken over the agency, or maybe sort of has existed in the agency for a really long time, and it just wasn't as noticeable until they brought in 20,000 new recruits who, they don't know anything about.
And a social media team that's following them all the time.
Yeah, right, exactly. So
they are broadcasting this.
Yeah. And so I haven't independently verified this, but I read something earlier this week that something 15% or so of all ICE agents in the country are currently in Minneapolis, right? What is happening in Minneapolis, you can really only describe as an occupation of the city by the federal government, right? I think that is really the only way that you can currently the only way you can describe what is currently going on.
Which it really then brings Mayor Frey's comments into, I think, appropriate focus.
Yeah.
If your city that you are responsible for maintaining public services in is being overrun, and there is a constant, roving protest, basically, because that is what follows. Yeah, that's hard to manage for a city that it was not prepared for it.
Yeah, and I think to just sort of close out the thought here of like, you can't really go about your everyday life without worrying about ICE agents deciding that you are a threat and acting with impunity to do whatever they think is appropriate in the moment to remove that threat, whether that's tearing you out of your vehicle, whether that's shooting tear gas into your vehicle, right? Pick one of these things that have happened over the past week in Minneapolis, or that have happened in the last several months of these sort of rotating ICE raids around the country. Like, it creates a situation for the average person where they simply cannot exercise their rights as a citizen, right? And I think that is maybe what you were getting at, Megan, when you said like the ability to predict behavior is important.
Mm-hmm.
It is necessary for us to be able to predict behavior in order to exercise our rights.
And those rights are not just the right to protest, the right to free speech, the right to freedom of assembly. Those rights include the right to drive down the street.
Yeah, the right to free movement, right?
Freedom of movement, the ability to go to work and come home, the ability to raise your children in the way that you want to raise them. If you need to leave your home to take your children to school, ICE agents are interfering with that.
The right to feel secure in your person and home, right?
Yep.
Like all sorts of things, right? Just like the general, like exercising the rights of a person who's going about their daily life are what's being threatened here, without being accosted and asked to show your papers by an agency that has no right to ask that question of you in the first place.
Yep. So I want to kind of bring us maybe to a close. We'll see. I think we are going to want to talk about why or how we can actually come to some sort of resolution with this after the Trump administration, when there is an after. Why do we need to fix this? There needs to be a trust established between the public and agents of the state. This is the core of legitimacy, which is one of the things that I work on as a political scientist. Legitimacy is the belief that the process was and is fair, such that you will comply with directives or decisions even when they are harmful to you or contradict your self-interest. I got a speeding ticket on the way north in December. I don't want to pay it, in that I'd rather spend that money on something else, but I violated traffic laws. Those laws were fairly applied to me, and I'm going to pay the ticket.
Wow, a criminal on my show. Wow.
Right? A violator. I don't know that I'm a
violator.
Criminal. That is my first one ever, by the way, you guys. I am 37 years old. Had a nice chat with the trooper, it was a good talk. But you have to be willing to voluntarily comply with state action that goes against your self-interest. When we stop perceiving the state's decisions as legitimate, then we may stop complying with decisions that run counter to our interest. And from there are two paths. The first is that state institutions fail because they require our voluntary compliance to keep going. There are not enough CHP troopers to come knocking on every door to collect the money for every ticket they wrote if you won't voluntarily pay it. The second is massive efforts of state coercion. So that situation where a CHP trooper comes to everyone's door.
And I think it's important to recognize that neither of these paths is good. Right?
Nope.
Both of these are bad. Like you need like strong institutions. You need like you could like retitle this podcast "Act in a Pro-Social Way," right? Like that could be the title of the podcast. Is like,
it doesn't look as good on a t-shirt, I gotta tell you.
It doesn't. But that's sort of like one of the defining ethoses.
I don't know, man. I'm not going to try to pluralize that.
One of the defining ethes, I don't fucking know. One of the defining features of this show
is
that people should act in a pro-social way. And part of acting in a pro-social way is when you recognize that you have violated some norm of society, some law that exists for a good reason, you rectify that behavior. And I think the important part of what Megan said there about getting a traffic ticket is the law was fairly applied to me, right? She was in fact speeding. Shame. Right?
Middle of nowhere Shasta County, man. I got a long way to go.
She got caught doing it, right?
Yep.
She was engaging in unlawful behavior. And I think we can recognize that speeding is bad. It's dangerous, right? I could do it. We'll do a whole episode at some point. Reject speeding, embrace driving the speed limit, about all of the bad things that come out of speeding.
It is. It really genuinely
is
one of the fatal five.
Yeah. It's truly incredibly dangerous, right? Something like nearly 1/3 of all fatal crashes have speeding as a result. It's tens of thousands of deaths a year.
I really inadvertently tapped on one of your special interests, didn't I?
You really did. But, sorry.
But that's not the main point here.
Refocusing. Megan is rectifying that violation of social norms because she recognizes this is the right thing to do. The law is being faithfully applied to me, being fairly applied to me. If we start perceiving basically all of the decisions of the state as arbitrary and capricious in some way or another, then no one knows what acting in a pro-social way actually looks like. Right? No, it's impossible, right? For everyone to sort of determine in their own way exactly what the pro-social way is. We require these institutions and norms and laws in order to sort of structure our everyday interactions among people in society, right? And so if you think that you can be accosted by ICE agents for no reason other than you were driving children down the street home from a basketball game, right? For no reason other than you said something that rankled them in the wrong way at the wrong time after they were having a bad morning, right? Then the entire structure of what constitutes appropriate social interactions starts to break down. And that's the best case scenario, right? Is that people just start acting in arbitrary and capricious ways themselves because the repression from the state is arbitrary and capricious. The worst case scenario is that the federal government decides that it's going to occupy your city, which is what's happening in Minneapolis right now. And I think an important element here, and something I've heard people sort of surmising about, is that Minneapolis is basically the largest city that they could do this in, right? Los Angeles is too geographically large for an agent surge of a similar magnitude and proportion to have done the same thing that's happening in Minneapolis. Same thing with Chicago, same thing with New York, right? But Minneapolis is a city of, I think, roughly around 500,000 people or so.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit more geographically compact, right? There's a clear downtown core to the city. In fact, you may have seen maps of the fact that the shooting of Renee Nicole Good happened just 4 or 5 blocks away from where George Floyd was killed, right? It's a small enough city where this kind of occupation could work, quote unquote, from ICE's perspective. What ICE is trying to project in Minneapolis is that they could do this anywhere. Presently, they can't. There are not enough ICE agents to do this everywhere. There are not even enough ICE agents to do this in one place, if that place is larger than Minneapolis. But if we continue down this road, if Trump decides that he's going to invoke the Insurrection Act, if he calls out more National Guardsmen, if he tries to use the American military on American soil, that is the worst case scenario. That is what happens next. That is, you do something that rankles the administration. You call them liars on a podcast, for instance, and they decide they are going to show up at your door to repress you. That is the alternative to the best case scenario of social norms and mores simply starting to break down. Neither of these situations is good.
Well, on that happy note,
God, Megan, geez, no. You can't stop us there. You can't stop us there. We promised the people that we were going to talk about what these accountability mechanisms might actually look like. I think that we owe it to people to at least hold forth a little bit.
We're going to hold forth a little bit.
As someone with, this law enforcement policymaking background, January of 2029, some Democrat is in the White House. They have the ability to hold people accountable for their actions these last several years. What does accountability look like to you? What do you think it looks like 3 years from now?
I am very torn on this because I would like to see from an employment standpoint, I would like to see rules fairly applied to individuals, but also individuals have a responsibility to comply with the law. Law enforcement is fully aware of this. They know that they each have a responsibility individually to comply with the law. So this is not going to surprise anybody that they are expected to be in compliance with the law at the end of the day. So what I would like to see happen is a independent and robust process of evaluating individuals' behavior over the last, at that point, will have been 4 years, and determining wrongdoing on the basis of whether or not they were in compliance with the law, whether or not they exceeded their authority, depending on the severity. I think we could see obviously terminations, but also retraining, depending on whether or not the violations were insufficient to merit termination. There's an argument that I could make to fire everybody, clear the whole thing out, and start over. You have to be rehired if you're going to come back. I think that might be the easier option.
This would be my preferred policy solution, is short of just getting rid of immigrations and custom enforcement, which I think would actually be my preferred policy solution here.
Yeah.
If you are going to keep it around, and I'm, agnostic on whether or not I think that the next Democratic president will have the balls to get rid of it. You'll have to pardon my French there, dear listeners. I'm sorry, but I'm a little fed up, right? Short of getting rid of the agency, everyone needs to be fired. Everyone needs to be gone, and you need to be rehired if you're going to continue, right? I think that is the bare minimum for accountability here for individual ICE agents. And then for the leadership of this organization, everybody needs to fucking go to jail. I'm sorry. I don't care what part, I don't care where in the chain of command you are an enabler, and I was just following orders is not a defense that works. It isn't. Everyone in the leadership structure who has enabled this, who has not voluntarily left the agency by the end of Trump's term because they refuse to carry out these illegal orders, needs to be prosecuted.
Yeah, we've talked about this before in terms of under what and how. And it would require some sort of criminal civil rights violation as opposed to a Bivens claim, which is civil. But yeah, there need to be consequences for the violation of individual civil liberties in this way. And quite frankly, I think we can certify the entire population of Minneapolis as a class for this.
If only Minneapolis, I don't think it will stop there, right? Quite frankly.
Yeah.
Frankly,
this is something that we do in this country over and over and over again. Something happens, lies are told, people die, people have their lives destroyed, and we move on. To ensure, I think, a peaceful transition of power, we have decided that we just get to move on. Brian Williams was held more accountable for lying about Iraq than George W. Bush was. And nothing happens. you see the same thing with Watergate. Nixon is pardoned immediately because, we need to move on as a country. The only way we move on as a country is by holding people accountable. And I haven't done enough research into truth and reconciliation commissions to know if that's actually a viable alternative here. We have a system for that. It is the criminal justice system. And if it's been good enough for all of the Americans and other residents of this country that you have been subjecting to it for 4 years at this point, it's good enough for you.
Yeah. And I would say one thing that we didn't talk about all the way back at like what does a proper accountability procedure look like? These investigations need to be done by not the Department of Homeland Security.
Yes, absolutely.
They need to be done by another part of the government. Frankly, they need to be done, I would argue, by a special commission set up by Congress.
Yes.
They need to be done by not the executive branch. Right?
Yes.
In the
there
same
has not
way,
been enough separation of power here at all. I am so distraught by what has been going on at the FBI and the Department of Justice. It needs to be another reason why it should be happening in a criminal trial is because then you're over with the judiciary, not in the executive. The executive absolutely cannot investigate itself. And you need the most unimpeachable, in a character sense, not in a legal process sense, individuals around making these decisions. I mean, I know no one would ever go for this, but I would look outside of the country, honestly.
You're not wrong, quite frankly. You're not wrong. Bringing in people, I mean, this is like what was done at Nuremberg, right? They brought in non-German jurists and prosecutors. They decided the legal frameworks under which it was going to be conducted, right? And it's the entire basis for international criminal law, right? It is. International human rights. Almost everything, like, can trace some part of it back to those Nuremberg trials. And I think that having someone come in, again, as you said, no one would go for it. But it might frankly be a little bit of what's necessary here.
Because the bigger concern here is that we need to have confidence in what is left afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if it's entirely swept away, people's lives are shattered. Kids have lost parents. If we don't actually take steps to rectify that, then I think that lack of trust keeps just eating away at our democracy. So long as we still have one, it's just going to keep gnawing at it. And I don't know how we come back.
Yeah. On that note, while we were recording this last piece here, I've gotten a push notification from the Washington Post. The Justice Department issues subpoenas for Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey as part of their criminal investigation. So that's where things are headed.
Okay.
That's where things are headed.
Okay.
I have not read whether this is Washington Post is paywalled. I've stopped paying for them since Bezos's thing, right?
Yeah.
Assuming that is part of a criminal investigation into what happened, good. Assuming that it is a criminal investigation into Governor Walz and Jacob Frey, this is, again, where we are headed if we don't actually engage in some sort of accountability making at the end of this term. Again, Megan said sort of at the beginning of the episode there were going to be instances in which we were left a little speechless. This is one of them. Things are not good. Things are not good. Wish I could leave
Yeah.
it with a little bit more of a hopeful note. That's what I try to do in these episodes.
Yeah. Just to give a little more detail on that. The governor of Minnesota and mayor of Minneapolis are being investigated for impeding law enforcement.
Yeah. So that's where we're at. That's where we're at in terms of the lack of accountability and the moving heaven and earth to ensure that you don't have to face accountability. We're going to leave it there.